Welcome to SJIMA's Symposium, The Art of Compassion, Giving, Receiving, and Lessons Learned, in conjunction with the Shades of Compassion exhibition. I would like to introduce our moderator, Dr. John Colkin, who is also the president of the Shades of Compassion Foundation and has made this exhibition possible. Dr. Colkin is a clinician, a musician, a global medical volunteer, an internationally recognized author, photographer, a health coach for integrative medicine, and, as I said before, president of the Shades of Compassion Foundation. Dr. Colkin has had 4 private audiences with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and based on that, he has been a principal organizer of numerous compassion-centered initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you. Barbara's wonderful, and for those of you who don't know Barbara personally, she is the curator that put all this exhibition together. So, first round of applause. In no particular order, but we have a very distinguished panel with us today. Since he's the first one on the list, Phil. For those of you who don't know Phil, he's both an incredible photographer, author, filmmaker, who has traveled the world documenting indigenous and tribal cultures. Very compassionate individual, interested in bringing out socially relevant topics. He's done multiple TED Talks, and his latest documentary, Crazy Wise, is all about the paradigm shift, the difference between Western cultures and how it interacts with mental health. So thank you, Phil, for being here. Peg LeBlanc, sitting to his left, is a marriage and therapy counselor, a therapist here on the island. She's a long student of Dharma, and I take from that she has some interest in Buddhist principles.
Indeed.
And interestingly also, what I didn't mention before is that Phil, years ago, photographed the Dalai Lama. So there's for some reason, a theme here. I don't know what it is. Something related to the Dalai Lama. She has been able to find a balance between using psychotherapy from the Western perspective with Eastern traditions, which is a wonderful blend that is quite valuable, I think. So thank you for doing that work. Reverend Greg Juan, who has given us permission to call him Greg for this gathering, has been here at Friday Harbor leading the Presbyterian Church since 2018. He was previously in Oregon and also in Georgia. One thing that I would like to ask him in this situation where he's really on the spot is I understand he's a great baker, but he hasn't provided me in a compassion way of his works to anyone in the room that I'm aware of. But thank you for being here anyway. And finally, last but definitely not least, is our friend Meg Partridge. For those of you who don't know her, she is the director, along with her husband, of Craig, of the Imogene Cunningham Trust, who we're very fortunate to have Imogene Cunningham's work here in the exhibition. She's also a filmmaker in her own right, and proud to let you all know that her one of her films, Portrait of Imogene, was nominated for an Academy Award. So she not only supports Imogene's work, also her father, who was a superb photographer, but in her own right is quite the accomplished individual. So thank you for being here. We were planning on having a conversation among us for about an hour or so, and then leaving things open for conversation and questions from all of you. We have a long list of things to go over here that we'll never get through. So in the Buddhist tradition, realistic expectations, we'll see where this adventure takes us. Just so that we're at least all on the same general page, compassion, it's a term that gets thrown around quite a bit. And the definition that we're using, well, it's not up here now, for the exhibition is compassion is the intention to respond with kindness toward those who might benefit, motivated by a true, authentic concern for their well-being, not what am I going to get out of it by being nice to them. So that's kind of our basic theme. Oh, okay, here we go. So I guess the first question, really for the panelists, and we can go in whatever order you want, is in general, most of us try our best to be kind, but despite our best intentions, things can go awry, particularly if we're not guided by wisdom. So maybe some of you could share, open up your soul with some efforts that you've made to be compassionate, maybe some of the lessons you've learned about when it doesn't go so well. Just kind of like, let's kind of get started on that. Who wants to jump in first?
I'll go.
You're up, right?
Yeah, well, the part of it not going well is a daily experience for me, just because I talk to people for a living. And the photograph, I'm going to talk about the photograph that I chose to put it up here, which is Phil's photograph. And it's a lovely, lovely picture of a young boy guiding an older person, or accompanied by an older person. And I just, when I saw that, I thought about what I do for a living and how I might say something today that would help all of you just like put me out of business. You know, so, and that would be listening. You know? So when I look at that picture, I think of that small boy and what the older gentleman has to offer to him and what he has to offer to the older gentleman. And that it's just such a beautiful photograph. And how valuable they are to each other. Seemingly in a place that doesn't look particularly hospitable, I guess, which would be any place on planet Earth, quite frankly. So anyway, that's kind of what I think of when I think of my failures of compassion. Almost always have to do that I wasn't listening properly to the person that's talking to me. That I was jumping ahead because I think I get what they need and I want to say something valuable to them. So anyway, that's my thought about my compassion failures. You know.
Thank you.
I'll confess, we're good at that. So, when I was in seminary, I had a job driving a van for a homeless shelter childcare place. So I would go to the homeless shelters and pick the people up and take them around. And at one shelter, people were really being verbally abused by the director of the shelter, racial slurs. It was a bad situation, but they needed to live there. And so I thought, I'm going to solve this, my compassion, by giving one of the gentlemen a micro, remember those cassette recorders? He can record the racial slurs. And somebody found the cassette recorder on him, and he was kicked out of the shelter. And I realized what I needed to do was show compassion and treat him with dignity while he was riding the van and not try to solve it. So I found that trying to solve problems and be the answer sometimes heads the wrong direction in our compassion.
That's, yeah, powerful.
Yeah, By the way, this is a young boy leading his blind grandmother on a daily walk, which he did every day and every night, in the morning and in the evening. So I had where it really didn't go wrong, but it could have gone very wrong in my attempts to tell the story about the invasion of Tibet by the communist Chinese. And I went over to Dharamsala to start this project that became my first book. And I was very upset by what I had learned about what had happened in Tibet, Tibetan people. And I decided I would tell the story through portraits. I was mainly doing portraits at the time, and I loved that process. And I just wanted to do portraits of everyone from the most remote nomad to the Dalai Lama, and let those individuals tell the story. I mean, we're fans of People magazine, and we're a culture of the individual, so I thought that would be the best way to do it. And so I started with the refugees coming out of Tibet, and they would escape after being tortured or having family members killed. And I was hearing all these stories as I was doing these interviews and portraits, one after the other. And it was gut-wrenching to hear what they had been through. And I'll never forget, especially one man, Halden, who held my hands while he was talking to me. He had been in prison for 33 years, had all his teeth kicked out in beatings along the way, starved at times, and he was this kind old man. I just thought, how could he be like that? But anyway, as I was doing these interviews, about 4 weeks into it, the Dalai Lama put out a little notice in Dharamsala saying he was going to give a public speech. And he told the crowd, and I'll never forget this, and I was sitting up, he was up here and I was kind of over here with a group of Westerners, and we were listening to his talk on an FM radio, the translation. And I'll never forget when he told that crowd, and I could see many of the people that I had interviewed and heard these stories of what they'd been through. And he said, I'll never forget it, treat your enemies as if they were precious jewels, because it's your enemies, not your friends and family that you love. It's your enemies that are going to teach you tolerance, patience, listening, deep understanding on your way to your own freedom and enlightenment. And that, so I was there to do this human rights story, and I'm thinking, what about standing up to your enemies? What about standing up to bullies? What, you're just going to let these people run over you? And I was upset about it. And as I spent time being around the Tibetan culture and seeing what their practices do on a cultural level in general, I became very understanding of that process of taking time to calm yourself, what you went over with me this morning, calm yourself. It's easy to have compassion for somebody you love. I mean, that's what it is, it's love. But how about the people, especially right now, while we're at each other's throats, like I said to John today, like I've never seen it in my lifetime. And so how do we get past that and take time to, instead of name calling and othering, to get to that place where you're listening, understanding, and eventually loving. Yeah. So it could have gone very wrong if I went over there to do a human rights story. There's the bad guys. The Tibetans are the good guys. That's the book I wanted to do. And it turned out Tibetan Portrait, the title, Tibetan Portrait, The Power of Compassion.
That's a hard one to follow. For me, compassion also evokes another word, and that word would be communication. And when I'm in this room with all of these phenomenal photographs, I think of it as a person who, behind the camera, is communicating ever so briefly, or perhaps for a period of time, but often they're brief moments with the person in front of the camera. And that relationship is a very unique relationship in my experience that I have found transmits not just from the camera to the person who you're photographing, but also the other, very much so, the other way around. My godmother was Dorothy Lang, who was a phenomenal photographer and had immense compassion behind that camera. And when I was a little kid, actually she died when I was 12. When I was a little kid, we'd go to her house, and every time we went to her house, there was a photograph that she had pinned up on her door. And you'd go in and go, oh. And then she'd take you to it by the hand. Mudsy, I was called Mudsy. Look at it. Because she just wanted to imbue that passion of compassion in all of us. So when I look at photographs, I look at the relationship and that communication so much. And that's what we have on the walls that I see today.
That's wonderful. Everyone's kind of touching a little bit on emotions. So how our minds, our bodies, our emotions respond to something. So how and when do you follow your emotions, your instincts, versus the cognitive side of whatever your being is, your logical thinking? How do you balance those things? That's maybe a tough question.
Taking a moment to take a moment, if we talk about mindfulness, for example, you couldn't throw a pebble in a room full of therapists and find one who's not dealing with teaching people about mindfulness. But it's very difficult sell, really, in the day-to-day, because we hear things and our reactions are immediate. Human intelligence is so fast, so rapid, and emotionality precedes the cognitive part. We have really strong emotional reactions to things, and then, if we're lucky, we've learned how to think about it before we speak. If you're lucky, you've learned that. Going back to the one thing that I would reiterate today is listening, and that take a moment. You have all the time in the world to respond to somebody, and that moment of taking a moment to slow it all down and consider, what would be a wise comment in a given moment. That's really hard to do. I'm not soft-selling that. It's really difficult. And it's difficult for me, which is why I'm talking about it. So just take a breath, slow it down. What does that person mean versus what do I think they mean? And that's a bit what I think, going to your point, Phil, that's what I think we're not doing. Everything's very ramped up right now, and people are worried about where it's all going. So we've become more reactive to each other than ever. And so take a breath, give yourself a moment, go slow, go a little slower.
And be curious.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that word reactivity because, as a pastor, I know the temptation to be, as somebody told me, a dog at a whistlers conference. Just any need, you're just running to the next person who says, I'm hurting. And then you're doing it more out of your own need to be seen as helpful instead of the need that's there. So 2 practices that have been a lifesaver for me. One is weekly Sabbath keeping. And I know that's common in a lot of faith traditions where you drop it all and rest unless there's a hospital emergency and just take a breath. And then another is a monthly silent retreat. And you go away to a quiet place and turn off the cell phone. Sometimes I come back from that and the person will say, "You've been gone for a prayer retreat, haven't you?" They just look at me and can tell I'm not as reactive. So those help me not be that dog at the conference.
Well, I could only add a bit, which is I think looking at things from a different perspective always helps. And you can do that physically and you can do that emotionally and spiritually. So that's sort of something that actually a Cameron has taught me. Anyway.
When Phil and I were together this earlier today, we were having a conversation and kind of getting into this topic of when we're dealing with challenges in our lives, whether it's personal, family, whether it's political, whether it's in our business or whatever it might be, how do you navigate from that challenge to a compassionate response? How do you do it? And being somewhat of a scientist and a physician, I like to, if possible, come up with an algorithm, so to speak, of what might or might not be helpful for me. So what I try to do is pretty much what I call a 6-step process. So I'll give you an example in the operating room, but you can come up with a different one if you want a different scenario. So when faced with a challenging situation, let's say I'm in the operating room and I'm getting in there, I specialize in anything that goes from the tip of the finger to just above the elbow. We can do consults, afterwards. Perfectly fine, no charge. And let's say I've done the examination and they've signed the op permit and done all that things. Get in there and things just aren't looking quite right. There's something strange going on, anatomy or whatever. So step number 1 is I have to be focused. I have to be truly present and focused. So if we're in one of these situations where we're trying to be helpful, trying to be compassionate, if we're not truly focused on the present, if I'm distracted because, oh gosh, they forgot to get this equipment, or there's a patient waiting in the office and I've got to go see afterwards, then I'm in trouble. The patient's in trouble, from the get-go. So step number 1 is be focused with who it is that you're interacting with. Step number 2 is emotional awareness of how am I responding to the situation? What's a red flag? Am I starting to get a sick feeling in my stomach or clenching my teeth or whatever it might be? So I've got to have that self-awareness of what's going on in my body. Step number 3 then is, if I sense that, is to calm myself. So if you're hearing someone saying something and it's a political issue and you're getting all tense, you got to calm yourself down as best you can. Otherwise, your mind is clouded. You're not thinking clearly. You're reacting your own emotions. So that's step number 3. Step number 4 is remove any bias, preconceptions I might have had, or what I was going to find when I got in there in the operating room. Okay. So what I'm doing is I maybe step back from the operating room table for a minute, pause, take a few breaths. I can't be worried about the nurse is going to say, what's Dr. Colkin doing? Why, he's supposed to have all the answers, Why is he pausing? The worst thing I could do would be to rush forward, and my ego says that I have to, get it all right and have it all right answers right away. So I have to put my ego aside, okay, any bias about what I thought I was going to find, or what that, in the cases you all mentioned about, what was that person trying to say? What were they really trying to say? Not what did I think they were trying to say? So that's step number 4. Step number 5, try and recruit as well as I can a little bit of wisdom, what's really going on here, what are the real facts, looking at it from multiple angles and whatnot. And then number 6, respond with compassion. What's the right thing to do in this particular situation? So the same 6-step process works, for me anyway, when I'm in any kind of a situation where there's some conflict or challenge or whatever. Any other comments or thoughts on this concept of how to be compassionate?
How do you do it with yourself?
Perfect. You knew exactly where I was going with this. Wait, and I didn't, this morning when we were together, I didn't pay attention. Okay. So, that's the other one, balancing compassion for others with compassion for self. Okay? That life balance thing, living in balance, inner harmony, and all that. So, how do we, I'm posing this question, how do we navigate that process of being compassionate toward others while at the same time showing compassion to ourselves? Who wants to grab onto that one?
Well, I don't think you can be compassionate to others without being compassionate to yourself.
Did you hear that?
Say again.
You said it.
Oh, I don't think you can be compassionate to others without being compassionate to yourself.
Why? That's where I was going to go next. I have a plan.
Well, it takes one's own awareness to be able to express something outside your body that you can express outside your body. You have to know it inside yourself first. I mean, it's a basic, like learning how to crawl, to walk. How can you do that? How can you express compassion to others without having experienced that yourself?
And knowing how to do it for
Yeah.
yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's individual. I mean, everyone
Yeah.
comes to that conclusion and solution and technique on their own, correct? I mean, we don't all do things the same at all, but at the same time, we have this pattern, this humanity trajectory that expresses itself repeatedly, time and again. So.
Well, alrighty then. I just think that's a great topic. I was up at the Gompa here on the island, which is not functioning as it once was, but there was a woman who asked a Kenpo Pema Wangdak a question about, well, what she said is that she identified herself as a big phony. And I went, oh. And then because she was a psychologist who really worked very hard to have compassion for people all the time, and she told him that she was ending up angry all the time. Well, he's a very intelligent, abrupt person with a wonderful mastery of English. And he looked at her and he says, well, that's because you don't have compassion for yourself, so back to the drawing board. So the notion that you could do for others what you don't really fully understand is not a great idea. But I would say that functionally speaking, because I'm just a very practical person, kind of a nuts and bolts person really, would be perfectionism is a really good example of something that we could be doing that's the opposite of self-compassion. That driving, trying really hard to cross all the T's and dot all the I's, and then of course the outgrowth of that is we look at people that aren't doing it, it's really hard to have compassion for them, because if they would just dot those T's or I's and cross the T's, they'd be fine. So the self-judgment very rapidly spills over into other people. So, and I think initiating those acts of self-compassion is a challenge, because we're always demanding of ourselves. We want to be good people, right? We want to do things the right way. And you can just end up really driven and not very happy, So it's like the starting point, the Dalai Lama talks a lot about happiness, So I just don't think you can get to happy while criticizing yourself in an irrational way. Sort of accepting the mistakes that you make and, saying something like, I'll do better tomorrow.
And I've learned that whatever we model in our communities, whether it's a school or a church or a family, people will follow them. So if I'm not being compassionate for myself, people will say, oh, that's what I have to do. I have to hurry around. I have to be perfectionistic. And I'm thankful in our tradition, Jesus walked off and said, bye guys, I need time to pray and be alone. I need to rest. He modeled it so that his disciples could say, oh, there's balance here. So I'm still learning. But it's good to remember that whatever I do is contagious in how I care for myself.
Yeah, I'd like to bring out one point about this balance between compassion for others and compassion for self. If we don't have compassion for ourselves, which results in taking care of our physical and emotional health, eventually it's going to catch up with us. And then we'll no longer be in a position to truly be able to continue helping others. So if we're looking at the long-range, long-term plan, if we don't care for ourselves, then we'll eventually not be able to care for others. And the science is pretty darn clear about that. There's a reason that there's burnout. Prior to the pandemic, 60% of the US adult population was dealing with chronic stress, which shows up in the format of hypertension, cardiac conditions, sleeping disorders. If you look to your left and right, one of the people, either yourself or the person to your left or right, has a chronic sleep disorder, 30% of the US population. Depression, you name it, all these different conditions. And it's all related to stress. So if we're constantly trying to help others without caring for ourselves, then we're doomed for failure. We're doomed for failure. So we have to empower ourselves by having the strategies that are necessary to navigate in a compassionate way. One of the things in medicine that comes up is this concept of taking on the suffering of others. Well, I can guarantee you that if a physician took on the suffering of every patient, they're going to burn out. So now the same is happening in our general population, where we're bombarded with the negativity and we're trying to do everything and we can't. So it's the balance of realistic expectations. What can I really take on? Where can I really make a difference? Stick with my strengths where I can really make a difference and just accept that I can't do everything. So how has that played out in each of your professions and in your personal lives? About what strategies have you used to find that balance?
I can tell you I haven't found it. So my demons come out at night. That's when I get very self-judgmental of something I might have said or something I might have done during the day. And I haven't learned how to conquer that. So my question for you, John, is does your 6-stage formula work for somebody like myself who has this issue at night?
The short answer is there is certainly some hope.
I hope so.
The next response is a plug for the museum in two ways. Number one, I gave a presentation here about 3 or 4 weeks ago on this subject, and it's on the museum's website. And it provides a number of tools to empower an individual to navigate through that. The second thing is a plug for the museum about this incredible exhibition that Barbara put together, because it's based on the science of how we navigate through these things and how we have compassion in multiple formats. So the 6 pause stations, if you want to get on your cell phone or read them, you go to the QR codes and come back, spend hours here, and have a contemplative, meditative experience. Because we specifically put this together based on the science of how you do that. So it's no coincidence that the first station, pause station, on the other side is a calming station. That's the first pause station, is the calming station. And the last one is the action station. Okay. Anyway, I'll say this, I hope that's of some value. Any other comments about how you navigate this balance between self-compassion and compassion for others, and tricks that people have tried, or strategies that may work, whether they've advised others about? No takers.
I'll say something actually. And that is, my life managing a photographic archive now, I am just seeing hundreds of images a day. And we actually are working on my father's archive. We lived for almost 98 years and photographed for 80 of those. So we've gone through thousands of photographs. And I have to say, looking at photographs transports me to another way of seeing an approach. So that is, it's not all about what I'm experiencing. It's about what someone else is experiencing. And when I look around and see these really amazing photographs, but almost as importantly for me, I look at the curatorial aspects of this. In other words, how these are flowing, how they work together, and what they are saying and how they're speaking as a unit. And I think that's a really fascinating, and I'm always fascinated by it, but I think it's a really fascinating way to see how others express that sort of sense of compassion and getting out of one's own body in a way.
That was lovely what you just said. As you were saying it, I was looking at this particular corner here that has this unbelievable progression of compassion between people who touch. Just an utterly practical thing is, I paint, but when I'm not doing the therapeutic work, for many years, decades, I had as part of what I do the ability to work with children. And that's not sitting and talking about what you don't like about life. They cannot do that. So I had a section given over to art therapy and play therapy, and always looking for the, you don't really talk face to face with a child because it's completely overwhelming for them to do that. So we would focus together on color and form, and then what was amazing out of the color and form is they would start telling me something about how they see their predicament. That's interesting. So what I do when as a counterbalance to the very intense work of taking on the perhaps foolish responsibility of, could I be helpful to this person? I have that portion now is just given over to my own art, and I paint because it's what I would call mindless. It's not mindful, it's mindless in the way that I mean, which is I'm no longer problem solving in any way. It's very much well, I am problem solving, but is that color of blue discernible from that other one? So it's whatever you need to have an experience that is enriching. And I can't tell you how important that is as you grow older, that you have something that's engaging like that, that's personal. And so that's a very important thing to me for a balance of what I can do for anybody and how I take care of myself.
After 9/11, I heard Fred Rogers, good old Mr. Rogers, said, look for the helpers. Don't just look at the tragedy, look for the helpers. And they told us similar advice when I was in seminary. If you're going to a hospital room as a pastor or a chaplain, don't assume you have to make compassion happen and it hasn't started yet. But they said, God's already in the room. Compassion's already happening. You're just joining in. And then it takes the weight off of the individual person to look for the helpers. That's a practice.
So we've been talking a bit about connecting, connecting with others and these relationships. Someone had mentioned in the group before when we had a planning session how many hands there are in this exhibition. So I just want to pose to the group, what sensations or connecting hands and what is it about touch that is important? Particularly in our society now where everything's digital and Zoom links, Zoom meetings and everything else, that personal interaction. Do you want to touch on that?
That's just touch, right? It's connecting. Physically connecting. And hands do that. And then we have it shaking hands. Remember how it was when you couldn't shake hands for 3 years?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just being able to hug, touch.
I have a funny little anecdotal story. It's not so funny, but it's interesting to me, and that is when I used to work for Imogen as a kid, a teenager, spotting prints for her, and when someone posed a question, I was sitting there working, and someone posed a question, what do you do when you take a photograph of someone? How do you approach a portrait? She says, I always start with a portrait and I often focus on their hands. And what she meant by that in her further explanation was the hands tell the story for her. So she was often really looking at the hands. This is a photograph of her photographing Stan there. She was always looking toward that person, but the relationship of hands and humanity and portraiture was prominent in her view. Also this one, in the back, Sherwood Anderson and his wife Elizabeth Kroll. And you can see that touch moment was so strong to her. Sherwood Anderson came to her, Imogen, to get a portrait done for a publication. And this is what she found most interesting. She was always taking additional photographs for her own purpose, and this one really expressed to her that relationship, and she captured that. In many respects, she was focusing on the hand in that image for me.
I know as a portrait photographer, hands carry so much emotion. And one of the things I would have to do if I wanted somebody to get their hands in the picture, if it's on a cane or it's, somewhere up here, if I asked them to do that, there would be so much self-consciousness in that hand. And the trick I learned was I'd have to just shift their consciousness off of their hands. So my thing was I would take the camera and hold it and I'd bang it, like, what's wrong with this? And then all of a sudden, that hand would go into who they were. It wouldn't be concentrated, you know, there wouldn't be self-conscious.
Yeah. A distraction.
Yeah, but I love putting hands in a photograph.
That last photograph I was drawn to, circus performers. Let's see, the photographer is Kevin Mugrisky. And I loved the intimacy of that and the trust between those two. You can tell there's a history there. And it just reminded me of the importance of touch in our lives, whether you're holding a baby or I get to baptize and touch that little head. We do that when we ordain people. And when we visit a hospital room, very often, if they give permission, you can lay hand and comfort and pray. And that just evokes all of that power of touch for me, that picture.
One of the special privileges that I have as a physician specializing in helping people with problems with their hands is that I have license to hold their hand and examine them, which many other physicians don't have that opportunity in other specialties. So I think that again reflects this concept of the humanity, the individual. Medicine is considered not just a science, but an art. So as a physician, if I'm sitting on the computer typing in data and I'm not looking at the individual there and their expression on their face and the emotion, then I'm not helping. I'm losing half the story. So whatever senses we use, whether it's the hands by touch, or whether it's our instincts, those other senses are extremely important in having authentic connection in relationships, interconnectedness, and compassion. We can't just look at statistics to be compassionate. We have to have that extra layer. So I think that's really, really important. For those of you who have seen my book, Inner Harmony, Living in Balance, a lot of the photographs have hands in them. And the photograph on the cover is the one that's back over there called Nurtured, and it's all about hands, and I won't go into detail about that, but you could read about it. But the role that hands can play is really, really important. Any other comments related to the senses and hands? I know some of the panelists had requested that we have some of these specific photographs up behind us because they wanted to make some comments about them. Some have already been alluded to, but people want to point out ones that they requested we have up here and maybe talk about them a little bit. Go for it, Phil.
Well, I was brave enough to put my own up here. So this is a girl in Afghanistan, and she was on her way to school. And I was there in 2005, so the Taliban had come in and prevented girls from going to school, and I was doing the story on this woman that was brave enough to teach girls some language skills, some science, mathematics. During the Taliban, she had 130 girls coming to her little two-room house in 2 shifts. And when the religious police were knocking at the door, she had them jump in front of sewing machines. And they would come in and see they were sewing, and then, okay. Anyway, so this one is one of her students, and what it taught me about compassion was, I was really judgmental about these women that had to cover themselves like this, especially young girls. It's not the way we do it here. And so I found out later that she wears her burqa when she has a bad hair day. It was something that really served her. And so it just, I always have to remember when I go into a tribe or a different culture, you know, what I think is something that's a huge problem for them because we don't do it here. I had to be very careful of misplaced compassion.
Perfect. And someone had put up, had requested this piece.
I did.
Well, there we go. Okay, Phil, there you
I
go.
loaded the place. I mean,
One more shot.
I'll just say, this sums up compassion for me. It's pure love, right? There's no judgment, there's no questioning what that relationship is. And to have it cross species like this, it's just, that's it.
Our timing is incredibly perfect. We're almost at the hour, and there's only one photograph left, I think, that we haven't talked about. Is that right? Or do you want to make any more comments about that one?
No.
You good?
Yeah.
So this is one that I picked out by Antonio Nuno. And the reason I chose this gets back to this idea of bias, preconceptions of what's really going on, and the importance of getting more information before we make any judgments. So my initial reaction when I saw this was this poor gentleman, this poor boy in school, he can't play soccer because he's in a wheelchair and here's the soccer ball, right? That's not what this story is all about. He's helping him do homework. He's teaching him math. It has nothing to do with the wheelchair, it has nothing to do with the soccer ball. He's teaching him. He's showing compassion to him. Okay? So don't misread, get the information that you need. Don't go to snap judgments. Okay, it's not what's on the surface, it's what's going on the inside. It's important. Yeah. So with that, we wanted to open it up a bit for conversation, comments, questions. Each of you came here for a reason. And we'd really like to know why you came and what things are on your minds. And we can pass the mic around so you can say what you want to say. And please don't be shy.
I'd like to ask the question, what is the difference between compassion and duty? One comes from the heart, one comes from the head. And I can, in this photograph here, I could read in a duty. The child may be told to help their grandmother at home. And over here, the father with a little family in the car, he has a tremendous duty to those people. What's the division there between compassion and duty?
I think duty is often compassion in action. You know, so some compassion is something you can see a situation, have great compassion about it. But then it's a choice that you make if you're going to do anything about it. You know? So the child has chosen to, he might have been prompted by his mom, that it was his duty to do something for the grandmother, and he did. Now in the process, what's happening for that young man is he is going to the end of his day, and you might ask the question, how do I feel about what I did today? That is very much of an edifying building up of the person. So, we're a culture that really values and prizes following your feelings, right? About doing things. Now, sometimes feeling good in the moment and doing your duty aren't the same, right? But it's very, very, if I look at that child and I go, he's clearly a cared for child, if we're assuming that this was prompted by a sense of duty. That to me would be a child who's being cared for because he's being taught that compassion and duty are related things.
And one other thing.
I tend to agree with you, that duty is something that's externally imposed, whereas compassion should be coming from internal, becoming internally. So, I don't know if I disagree with you, I think what you said is great.
I don't think
Yeah.
disagreement.
But that's the way I think.
Well, one thing can lead to another.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
An external duty leads to an internal compassion, and that expresses itself again in the circle.
It's
Externally, yeah, yeah.
So years ago, my wife and I taught English in China, and to people who spoke Chinese. I'm not fluent in Chinese. And I got up to erase the blackboard. We had blackboards then. And the student ran up and said, no, I must do that, and erased the blackboard. And I said, thank you. And the answer was, it is my duty. And as a Westerner, I didn't like that answer because it sounded like, oh, they had to do it. They didn't want to. It wasn't a choice. But as I reflected on their culture, I think they were saying, I honor you so much that my choice doesn't matter. It's not about me. And then I thought, no, there's a beauty to that, it's my duty.
Yeah.
So I tried to learn from that, less individualistic than we Westerners are.
Yeah. And we are hyper-individualistic, I can tell you, but going into so many different cultures. I am. It gets me in trouble all the time.
There's that, in some cases, I think it's, one doesn't counteract the other. In other words, it can be both. It's more a matter of a balance of when is it too much duty, sacrificing one's compassion for oneself, and making sure you don't get into that kind of a trap. I just gave a presentation on this subject in Tokyo a few months ago, and one of the questions I was asked was, why is there such a high suicide rate among young women in Japan? There's a sense of responsibility of duty for caring for everyone else, particularly parents. It's an honor, but it's also a duty. And one of the reasons they have that issue more so in Japan than in many other countries around the world is because there's not that balance between duty and self-compassion. So it's an ongoing cultural issue in Japan.
Wisdom was brought up. And so my question is, how do we cultivate wisdom in a society that does not give time and respect to those who have wisdom? Everything is about speed in our culture. And if you talk about calming yourself, that takes time. And observation takes time. And we have so little of that. So how do we cultivate wisdom and compassion in our culture? That's a workshop.
I think that's a real good question. I know, us gray hairs are considered older, but in tribes, they're elders. It means a whole different thing. And yeah, we are a youth-driven culture. And our youth are in trouble right now, especially suicide rates. That's a crisis. Yeah. 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 And how do we become more community-oriented versus individually oriented? And what will that take?
I want to thank you for that question. It's such an important question, and I can't answer it. However, I just had a sort of unique personal experience going down to help a sister-in-law who's quite ill. And she has 20-year-old twins, and her husband, my brother-in-law, is possibly my favorite person in the entire world. So I went down there to be helpful. And it's a very difficult diagnosis that my sister-in-law has. And so there's the two 20-year-olds in the house, and they have also are raising a nephew and a niece who are 20 and 18. So I had 3 20-year-old boys and an 18-year-old girl, and my sister is incredibly distressed. And so the question is, how can I be helpful? So that I can cook. So I went into the kitchen. I spent 5 days in that kitchen. I had an apron on and everything. And it was really, I was like this magical, hilarious, unexpected, really high status position for 5 days. I was like, this is so awesome. Because the mother of that household, and she got there, and several hours after I got there, when she realized I'm in the kitchen tinkering around, she disappears. It's, well, where's Liz? Oh, she's still sleeping. She fell asleep and slept for 6 hours just because I arrived there. And it's like, wow, it's shocking. So I cooked for 5 days. I made bread, I made spaghetti, I made chicken, whatever. I just cooked and cooked and cooked. But here's, to go to your point about wisdom, where does it come from? What is it? I couldn't answer that question. But these young people kept wandering through the kitchen. Of course, there was food there. That helps. But they had so many questions for me. I thought it was so, as I was flying back, I said, that was just so interesting how many questions these young people asked me.
Like that?
Anything. Anything. It was like, well, did you travel when you were young? Well, yes, I did. Well, why did you like that? What did you learn from that? And, if you had it to do over, would you go to a different school? Or, why do you think you chose the husband that you chose? And the questions were all over the place. But I would go back to the thing, even though I was being asked questions, I noticed that I was more interested in what they had to say in response. These beautiful conversations happened, but it was taking the time. When would any of us have done that? Under what circumstances would I have gone to somebody's house and gone into their kitchen and been in that family cooking for 5 days? I felt like I had really arrived at Italian grandmother status. It was pretty awesome, but wisdom is time spent together. I think maybe that has a big part of what we're not doing as a culture.
Yeah.
Old people are not spending time with young people. And this was mind-blowing to me to spend 5 continuous days, and they're all going out to work. They all work 1 or 2 jobs, they're going to school. They're really lovely young people, so delightful. And I felt so lucky to spend the time with them. So.
They say the quote that says, "Food is love made visible." And it's not about me right now, but I've been in a similar situation. And I just did a lot of thinking about it. So my question is, did you find that the interest for your life and the questions happened as you were cooking and as they got to spend more time with you and you were feeding them, and I always go back to, you know, the mother who breastfeeds, there's an abandon from the child to the mother, and there's this trust that is being built in that moment around food. And so do you think that all this, the time that you spent and the presence, which is really important, it's not only about the food, it's about the care, it's about the presence, that do you think nurtured the conversations?
Yes, yes to all of that.
Yeah.
It would not have happened if I hadn't just been like an animated listening fixture in that kitchen. It was really quite a hilarious event. I'll probably do some writing about what happened with those 4 young people, who 2 of whom have parents that are struggling so badly that they're being raised by an aunt and uncle. You know, so it was just standing there making cookies. They asked me to make a type of cookie that they swear
that I'm famous for that cookie. No. And apparently I make that, but it's a snickerdoodle. I don't even like snickerdoodles, but apparently they come to my home, all of them at some point. And it's hysterical, because somehow they didn't print it on, you know, Auntie Peg, she loves us, she makes snickerdoodles. So how big was the plate of snickerdoodles that day?
I think in many ways, in order to navigate through all the things that we're constantly bombarded with and knowing where to focus, one of the things that may be particularly helpful is to first clarify what your core values are. What's really important to you. And there are probably, if you just think for a minute, at most 2 or 3 core values that you have. If you can keep those in mind as you navigate through your day and have to make thousands of decisions, it can help guide you in deciding what to say yes to, what to say no to, where to focus, you know, where to spend that time with the children while you're cooking. Those things can help. So what I try to do is start with, what are my core values? And based on those, what are my goals over the next 5 years, whatever it might be? Those goals then determine what my priorities are on a week's basis, or let's say on a particular day, when I get up in the morning, I think, okay, I have 3 main things that I want to get done today. Everything else, if it has to go to the side, that's okay. But then again, I'm going to be easy on myself, where I only get 2 of them done, have to shift gears, okay, it's okay. And then that helps with the thousands of decisions I have to make in that particular day. So it starts with values, core values, determines goals, which determines then priorities, which then determine minute-to-minute, day-to-day decisions. So by using that process, it helps me navigate through that jungle. And for me, that's what I use as kind of a form of wisdom. So again, that's my process. What other comments, questions? Yes, ma'am.
I'm actually desperate for the answer to this question, so let's put pressure on you. So what attracted me to the topic today was the terrible dysfunction in our society right now and how divided we are, which has been brought up earlier. And without getting into specific politics, I can just say that when I think about people who hold the views that are diametrically opposed to my own, I feel no compassion. So the question is, and I know that that's not, it sounds like I'm a terrible person, but I bet I'm not the only person here who is so fatigued from all of this that I can't find it. So what do you do? The question I want to ask is, what do you do when you're starting from a point of not being able to feel compassion for other people?
Okay, gang, who's gonna take it?
Yeah, I'm definitely struggling with that. I'm about to go see a film that I just heard reviewed called Civil War. Has anybody heard about this film? And the reviewer the one that everybody's talking about might happen. And I'm also reminded of the art, or life mimics art, when, what was the title of the film? It's China Syndrome, and then 3 Mile Island happened. So it worries me that that film's out there. But the thing that I want to see is, and the film was criticized for this, because the filmmaker doesn't make a bad guy and a good guy. Doesn't get into that othering. And so I'm hoping, it's a very hopeful film in that way, that we get past that, there's the bad guy, and there are the bad guys, and they're gonna destroy our democracy. And because I've got these divisions in my family, my daughter, and so how to approach that is very important to me on a personal level and on the societal level. And I just think it's deep listening, curiosity, being centered when you're with. And and just practice it with, like the Dalai Lama said to that group of refugees, this is your practice. This is your practice. You're given an opportunity here to practice this. And we're on a societal level being given that opportunity to do that. Yeah.
You know, it's interesting, for me, the whole sense of communication means opening doors, right? And if you can reach a common point, one tiny common point, I find that's helpful, because then you have a common point of departure, and we're all human. So then things start to open up, but without that, we're just closing those doors. So that sense of communication, however tiny it might be, I think it has to start somewhere.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this whole dilemma, and doing some study on hatred. There are some books, not many, on hate. And one quote was, "We become what we hate." In other words, as we hate the other person, we need to defend against them, and we end up mirroring them. And I love these photographs where you know that the photographer is seeing the other person as a human being. And I know when hate takes root in me, I see the other person as a thing, or they're just a beast. You know, we get into that objectivity, and they're just slime. Instead of stepping back and saying, okay, that person I would never vote for, is there anything of humanity that I can admire? And to the extent that I can't, I know I need a lot of help. If there's nothing, then I'm probably mirroring the hate.
Does anybody here remember Alfred E. Newman? Does anybody remember what his motto was? It was all written on the cover. What, me, worry? So human beings are really anxious animals. We are afraid at all times, and it's at a fever pitch in this country. You know, I suppose people on the right are afraid of changes they don't want. On the left, we're afraid of changes we don't want. Yeah. You know, the listening piece that's been, and you eloquently may put it as communication, you know. Listening without reactivity, because it's the reactivity that's going to ignite some match somewhere with this. So To the extent that I'm capable, I sometimes will hear someone saying something that is just causing me to be extremely reactive inside. And if I don't want to accelerate into some sort of verbal battle with this person, which isn't very productive, hardly ever, I've learned to literally relax the whole organ that is inside my jaw. The most difficult muscle in the entire human body to control is the tongue. So, do this little thing with me for just a moment. Just take your hand, reach up the top of your throat, and kind of go in where you think your windpipe is, and flex your tongue. Can you feel the root of your tongue? Okay, that's good. Drop your hand, take a breath. Now, in your mind's eye, move forward to the part of your tongue that's between your back molars. Now relax both of those. Take a breath. Now, find the tip of your tongue and move it back so it's not touching any of your front teeth. Any of your front teeth. Move your tip of your tongue back so it's not touching any of your front teeth. And take a breath. If you do that when somebody's saying something to you that you do not want to hear, or more importantly, you don't want to take a conversation someplace that you know it's not going to go, okay? Here's an interesting fact. So that's just the thing. If you focus on your tongue, because that tongue is connected to the frontal lobe where all the arguing takes place. Okay? Yeah. Where you muster the argument is up here in the frontal part of your brain. And when you do that with your tongue, the brainwave measurements of that are hilarious. What happens? That frontal lobe quiets right down. Its energy consumption drops. So you're less likely to get in a fight with somebody when you're doing that. Okay, so here's one last trick. A tip. UCLA has this excellent social psychology research program, and they did a test on the people's ability to tolerate ambiguity. How ambiguous is life? So, something's coming at me. I don't know if it's good or bad, but I'm going to find out, right? But I would prefer not to, so I'll probably jump to some conclusion about it before it ever gets here. So, this thing about, there's a lot of ambiguous stuff happening right now, and, just take care of yourselves, right?
Well, interesting that we speak so much about language here, and all of these images have no words.
Right.
So it puts you into a different state of mind, I think. For me, it does, for sure. And I think looking at things without words is a very valuable tool, certainly for me.
That's a beautiful point. Very good.
And one thing to go back to this politics situation that you're all touching on, it's important for me to understand that the research looking at young infants, like 3 months old, strongly suggests that we're intrinsically born kind, with very, very few exceptions. So that person that thinks differently than I do about something is because of the influences that they've experienced in their lives. Just like every photograph that you look at here, you're taking your own experiences into the experience, and it impacts how you interpret it. So that person that I disagree with strongly on a political topic is because of the experiences they had in their lives, which I know nothing about. So breaking bread, finding something in common that you can respect them as a human being as a starting point, and find something that you have in common is a great place to start. But at the same time, picking your battles, self-compassion, do I really want to get into this conversation with that individual, or is this not a good time? So that balance, again, is important. We have used up an hour and a half. One of the reasons I know that is Barbara's just stood up. No, actually, I stuck a little bit on my watch, just a little bit. So, we thank all of you for being here. I can't express how much gratitude I have for all four of you joining in this conversation. So I think I'll leave it at that, and you're welcome to stay longer. We'll all be around for a while, and yeah, that's it. Thanks again very much.
I just want to clarify one thing. The exhibition was curated in conjunction with my colleague Anne Sheridan, who is sitting over there. So thank you very much.
Okay, we'll be around, so feel free to interact, and if anyone's interested, let's back over here too.